Okay, we are going to get into Punisher Annual number 1. This was on the shelves April 19th of 1988. We've got 2 Punisher-centric stories in here. This book takes place during the Evolutionary War event that's happening through a lot of the annuals in Marvel at this time. There's 2 stories. Our first story is called Evolutionary Jihad, and then our second story is called 3 Hearts. So our first story, we'll go ahead and get into that, and I'll talk about my thoughts for that. Our writer is Mike Barron, penciled by Mark Texeira, inked by Scott Williams, lettered by James R. Novak, and colored by Janet Jackson. Now, before we get into the story, got to take a look at the characters first. All right? Frank Castle, the Punisher, is going to be involved in this. I'm not going to go into detail who he is, but I will tell you that this story starts out, the war has taken him all the way to Colombia in pursuit of one of the biggest drug traffickers in the region, thus bringing us to El Caimán, also known as the Great White. He is a powerful Colombian drug lord who controls a major cocaine operation. While he is undeniably a criminal, he also sees himself as something of a provider for the people in his community, using his wealth to supply food, water, education, and medical care. Then there's Lucinda, El Caimán's daughter. She's not involved in her father's criminal empire, but ends up caught in the violence surrounding him. Her presence gives the story a more personal element and puts Frank in a situation where his mission becomes a little more complicated. And finally, we have the Eliminators, heavily armored soldiers working for the High Evolutionary. They are part of the larger Evolutionary War storyline and are carrying out a campaign against people and activities they believe are damaging humanity's genetic future. Their advanced armor and weaponry make them a much different kind of threat than the criminals Frank normally faces. And looming behind this, of course, is the High Evolutionary himself. He does not play a direct role in Frank's story here, but his ideology and his plans are what set the Eliminators in motion and connect this Punisher Annual to the larger Marvel event. Our story, Evolutionary Jihad, opens in Bogota, Colombia, where Frank Castle has tracked down one of the biggest cocaine operations in the city. His target is a drug lord now named El Caimán, a man with a reputation for moving enormous amounts of cocaine and disposing of his enemies in particularly gruesome ways. Frank is watching the operation from a rooftop, waiting for an opportunity to move in, but the streets below are still crowded despite the late hour. Before he can make his move, an explosion erupts nearby and the situation quickly turns chaotic. A man named Claudio is gunned down while trying to escape, and a young woman with him is wounded. Frank moves in to protect her, only to discover that the attackers are not ordinary gunmen. They are heavily armored soldiers equipped with advanced weaponry, including armor that easily shrugs off Frank's bullets. Frank manages to bring one of them down with a grenade and begins interrogating him. The man reveals that his group is attempting to eliminate drug users, criminals, and anyone else they see as damaging humanity's future. Before Frank can learn more armored attackers arrive, forcing him to flee with the wounded young woman. That woman is Lucinda, and Frank soon discovers that she is the daughter of the very man he came to kill. Lucinda leads Frank to one of her father's safe houses, where El Caimán's men are understandably suspicious of the heavily armed stranger wearing a skull on his chest. Lucinda convinces them that Frank saved her life, and he is eventually brought before El Caimán himself. El Caimán is not quite the simple monster Frank expected, though. He freely admits that he sells cocaine, but he insists that he does not sell it to the people living in his own community. Instead, he claims that the money from his criminal empire has allowed him to provide fresh water, food, schooling, and medical care to help the people their own government has ignored. Frank, he's not impressed. He explains that El Caimán was one of the 24 major drug dealers whose name he put into a fishbowl. El Caimán's name happened to be the one that he pulled out. For now, however, the 2 men have a bigger problem. The armored soldiers, whom Frank begins referring to as Eliminators, are still coming. Frank and El Caimán agree to a temporary truce. They will deal with the Eliminators first, and then they can settle things between themselves. The next attack comes quickly. An Eliminator storms the safe house, but Frank realizes that the visor in the man's helmet is a weak point. Using an armor-piercing round, he shoots through it and brings the attacker down. Unfortunately, more Eliminators are already closing in. Caimán's guards are forcing everyone to retreat. Caimán leads Frank and Lucinda through an underground tunnel to another safe house, where a helicopter is awaiting. His plan is to move the fight away from the city and toward a remote mountain compound where he has more men and weapons. Once they arrive, Frank gets a look at one of Caimán's more infamous possessions, an enormous aquarium filled with dangerous animals, including a couple crocodiles. Caimán casually demonstrates exactly what the tank is used for when one of the captured Eliminators is thrown inside and torn apart. There's little time to dwell on it though, the Eliminators are already on the way. Frank learns that Caimán has managed to acquire a Stinger missile launcher, although none of his men actually know how to use it. Frank does. When the Eliminators approach in a heavily armored craft, Frank fires the missile and blows it out of the sky. Unfortunately, destroying the aircraft does not kill everyone on board. The surviving Eliminators descend into the jungle and continue their attack. Frank quickly realizes that ordinary ammunition is not enough against their armor. Remembering their weakness around the visors and searching for anything capable of penetrating their suits, he gets hold of Teflon-coated ammunition and begins turning the fight around. One by one, Frank and Caimán's men begin taking down the armored soldiers. Eventually, the battle moves into the compound itself, near Caimán's aquarium and a large stockpile of ammunition. After a brutal firefight, only one Eliminator remains. From the top of a stairway, the last soldier reveals who has sent them: the High Evolutionary. The Eliminators are part of a much larger campaign designed to push humanity toward what their master considers its next stage of development. Drugs and other supposed genetic pollutants are to be wiped out, along with anyone who gets in the way. The final Eliminator attacks with a flamethrower, sending a wall of fire toward Frank. Frank waits for his opening, switches to single fire, and places a shot directly into the flamethrower. The weapon explodes, killing the last attacker. The Evolutionary War has moved on, but Frank's business with Caimán has not. With the Eliminators dead, their temporary truce is over. Caimán immediately turns his gun on Frank. Lucinda begs her father to let him go, but Caimán knows better. He understands that the Punisher came to Colombia to kill him, and he knows Frank will not simply forget why he's there. Frank only has one bullet left. Smoke fills the room, making Caimán difficult to see. Caimán taunts him, asking how Frank can possibly make this shot. Frank replies that he does not have to. He cannot miss the inside of a goldfish bowl. Instead of firing at Caimán, Frank fires his final Teflon-coated round into the massive aquarium. The supposedly impenetrable glass cracks, then it gives way. Thousands of gallons of water, fish, and the crocodiles come crashing into the room. Frank grabs Lucinda and pulls her to safety, and when the water settles, Caimán is trapped beneath the crocodile and appears to be dead. Lucinda is devastated. She asks Frank why he killed her father, insisting that Caimán was a good man. But Frank does not pretend otherwise. He tells her that her father may have done good things, but she knew what he really was. The story ends with Frank leading Lucinda away from the ruined compound and into the jungle. He has saved her life twice. He has also killed her father. And as the two disappear into the wilderness together, Frank has only one final concern: whether Lucinda might decide to put a bullet in his back before they find their way home. Looking back at the story now, I think the biggest compliment I can give it is that it still feels like a Punisher story first. This is technically the second chapter of the Evolutionary War, and Frank is suddenly dealing with these armored Eliminators who are tied to the High Evolutionary, but it never feels like Frank has been dropped into somebody else's comic book. He still has a target, he's still hunting major drug dealers, just happens to run into something much bigger along the way. I dug the Eliminators as opponents because they force Frank to adapt. He can't just overpower these guys. Their armor is too advanced. Their weapons are better, and they've got technology that Frank immediately realizes is beyond what he normally deals with. So he has to start figuring things out. He notices the weakness in the visors, and he gets his hand on some better ammunition. He uses the Stinger against their aircraft. Now that's the kind of Punisher I like seeing. Frank isn't superhuman, but sometimes he has to almost be a tactical savant because that's how he survives people who should completely outclass him. The Colombia setting also works, although it doesn't necessarily feel unusual for Frank. He's the type of character who will go wherever the target is. He's trying to cut the head off the snake, and in this case, that leads him to El Caimán. And I thought Mike Baron did a good job giving El Caimán more depth than just making him the stereotypical drug lord. We find out that he provides water, food, education, and medical care to the people around him. The government hasn't taken care of these people, so in his mind, what he does with the cocaine trade helps support his community. Now that didn't really change my opinion of him, but it did make him more interesting. We've seen this kind of character before, the criminal who does terrible things but takes care of his own people, but it gives the story something to wrestle with. And really, Frank and El Caimán have more in common than either of them would probably like to admit. Frank does something objectively terrible. He kills people, but in his mind, he does it for a good reason. El Caimán does something objectively terrible. He deals cocaine, but in his mind, he does it for a good reason. So that kind of makes Lucinda accusing Frank at the end of killing a good man much more interesting because the story is almost asking us where that line actually is. Frank has already decided where it is. Once you cross that line, there's no coming back. It doesn't matter that El Caimán loves his daughter, or that he feeds people, that he built a school. Frank knows what he does for a living, and that's enough. Lucinda also gives the story a really good complication because Frank keeps saving her. She's completely innocent in all of this, and Frank never wants innocent people getting caught in the crossfire. You see that throughout the story, whether it's Lucinda or the people living in the village. His war with criminals is his war. He doesn't want civilians paying the price for it. So there is that question hanging over the story. Does saving this girl and getting to know her make Frank reconsider killing her father? Well, clearly the answer is no. The temporary alliance between Frank and El Caimán made perfect sense to me. They have a common enemy, so they work together until that enemy is gone. And the instant the last Eliminator is taken care of, El Caimán makes his move because he knows exactly what is coming next. He knows Frank isn't going to suddenly shake his hand and walk away. I also like the fishbowl idea. Frank essentially has no particular direction when this starts. He knows what his mission is in life, but sometimes he has to decide where to point himself next. So he puts the names of 24 major drug dealers in a bowl and pulls out El Caimán. That's almost funny, but it also tells you something kind of disturbing about where Frank is mentally. And then they bring the whole fishbowl idea back at the end with the aquarium. I like the way Frank handled that. He's got one shot left. He knows the Teflon round can get through the glass, and instead of trying to shoot El Caimán through all the smoke, he just shoots the enormous aquarium. My only complaint? I wanted more violence. You got this giant crocodile there. You've already established El Caimán feeds people to this thing. I wanted that crocodile coming out of the tank and getting hold of him. Give me that nasty Punisher poetic justice. Instead, it looks like El Caimán basically gets trapped underneath it and dies. It works, but I wanted them to go just a little bit further with it. And then, this issue's got some nostalgia for me as well. I was 9 years old, getting ready to turn 10 when this thing hit shelves in April of 1988. And I can still remember where I was when I bought it. I'm pretty sure I was out of town with my mom and stepdad, standing in a Kroger or some other grocery store that had comics in the magazine section. 38 years later, I don't really remember this story, but I remember that cover. I remember the Punisher fighting those armored guys. I remember seeing Punisher Annual #1, and back then an annual felt like you were getting something special. It says special on the cover. You had this thick comic in your hands, 64 pages, and you felt like you were getting a ton for your money. And then there was the excitement of seeing Punisher included in this much larger Marvel event. I knew the Evolutionary War was happening. I had some of the other annuals as well, although there was no chance I had enough money at 9 years old to buy all 11 chapters. So just owning one piece of this giant Marvel storyline was cool. Reading it again now, I appreciate it much more than I probably could have back then. Mike Baron gives me a villain with a little complexity, puts Frank in a situation where we have to wonder whether he might actually reconsider his mission, and then he gives us the answer. Frank may understand why El Caimán does what he does. He may even recognize that there are good things about him. But understanding somebody is not the same thing as forgiving them. And the Punisher does not forgive. It adds some depth to Microchip, shows me that there's more going on underneath the surface, and then puts him back into Frank's world without overstaying its welcome. Between this and Evolutionary Jihad, I'd probably still give the edge to the main story. Frank being pulled into a larger Marvel event and having to deal with those Eliminators carries a little more weight for me, but as a backup story, Three Hearts does exactly what I want an annual backup to do.